to BFM 89.9, the business station.
The BFM Resource Centre, presented to you by Alliance Bank. It's banking made personal.
Good afternoon. It's time for Resource Centre on Enterprise. And I'm here with Graeme Maxton, who's an author, events moderator and presenter. And we're talking about his book, The End of Progress. It has been nominated for the Financial Times and Goldman Sachs Business Book of the Year Award 2011. Your book started talking about how our belief in the free market has failed us. We've obviously seen this, but what are our misplaced beliefs?
Well, I think that, there's several that are fairly obvious. One is that we're focusing too much on growth. If you think about the last 30 years, almost all the economies of the West and many of those of Asia as well have focused on a goal of growth. And all the headlines in the newspapers focus on growth. And it seems that that's become the primary measure of human progress. And if you look at the economies, most of our economies depend on consumption, which means that the growth depends on consumption, which means that it's our progress as a species is all down to buying flat-screen TVs and more socks, which doesn't seem to me to be a very worthwhile mission. The second, I think, big flaw is the way we price the world's resources. According to classical economics, we're meant to take account of all what's called the externalities, all the pollution that we cause and the fact that these resources will not be available for future generations, and we're not doing that. And that means that everything we use, including oil and water, is far cheaper than it should be.
Right. And you're talking with this focus on growth is at the expense of what's happening to countries and to companies as well.
It's true. Companies and individuals and indeed countries are focusing too much on growth and not on the welfare of their citizens or on creating a good society or indeed even creating a happier group of people. All we're doing is focusing on growth, and that means we're focusing on consumption and shopping.
Right. I'm just going to take you away from your book for a while. You recently spoke to BBC about the economic effects of the March earthquake and tsunami. What are your thoughts around this?
Clearly it's going to have a long effect on the economy of Japan. I think it'll have a knock-on effect on the supply chain and supply chain thinking across the world, because people realize that a lot of the supply chains have become very brittle recently, and we need to build perhaps some fat into them. But I think the biggest consequence is that it's making a lot of countries question their investment in nuclear power. And given what I was just saying about resources and underpricing resources, and the fact that we're reaching the peak of our oil capacity in the world, I think that has fairly major implications for our energy policies going forward.
All right. And so we'll back to your book again. Take us back to the Enlightenment age and Adam Smith and where we went wrong. How did this whole progress, what happened in the last 200 years, I guess?
Yes, I think the biggest change actually came in the late 1970s and early 1980s when Ronald Reagan entered the White House and Margaret Thatcher took over 10 Downing Street. And a group of economists, mainly from Chicago, but also in Washington, and people like the IMF and World Bank all got together and said, look, we don't need government intervention, we don't need markets to be controlled, we need everything to be free, and we need to let the markets free and they decide what happens in the world. And that wasn't actually the ideas of Adam Smith. He was a great advocate of free trade, but he certainly wasn't an advocate of overly liberalized markets which forgot their responsibility to society. That it was very important to him that there was a justice and fairness in the world, that we shouldn't have the sorts of inequalities in the world that we have today. And so this change in the late 1970s and early 1980s really brought about a different thinking. And that's what caused the financial crisis and is causing us to, I think, head in the wrong direction today.
And, we've seen what happened to Greece and also Iceland as well. And do you think that has been a wake-up call? And do you foresee more countries heading in that same direction? Or are they taking steps back now?
I think it's fairly clear that the financial crisis is certainly not past. If you look at the amount of debt that was in the system in 2007 in terms of bank debt or consumer debt, then most of that is still there. People haven't paid back the debts they owed, certainly in the West, and that's why we have these problems like Greece or Ireland. But we actually have a worse situation now, 4 years later, because we now have lots of government debt as well. And because of all this debt, it's going to constrain the rate of progress and the rate of growth that we have in the world economy for many years to come. And so, yes, I think we will see more countries getting into the same sort of difficulties as Ireland or Portugal or Greece have today.
And it's too late right now to, take counteractive measures?
It's not a question of, I think, of taking counteractive measures so much as putting our balance sheets back in order. It's simply a fact that we've spent far too much in the last 25 years based on this philosophy that we had to keep on growing, and that consumption was vital to our world. And if you look at in the US, for example, real incomes haven't risen there at all for most people, and yet spending has gone up, and it's all gone up because of debt. And what we need to do is get our spending back into control. We have to pay back some of the debt, and that means a lot of long, slow progress and a lot of pitfalls along the way.
Right. And coming up, we'll talk further about how economics has failed us. I'm here with Graeme Maxton, a Resource Centre on BFM 89.9. You're here in Enterprise, and this is Resource Centre. Frida Liu here, speaking to Graeme Maxton, author, events moderator, and presenter, talking about his book, The End of Progress. In your book, there's this chapter on the damaging power of me, myself, and I, and about Kiasu, bless you. What's that all about?
Well, part of the change that's taken place in the last 25 or 30 years has also been a shift in the way we think about ourselves. If you go back to the Enlightenment, freedom was about the freedom to think and to say what you felt. And today, freedom is much more about individuality. It's about expressing ourselves through shopping or just acting in our own interest and not looking at the interest of wider society. And so we have this situation where people are acting very selfishly, and that's also creating part of this problem of us heading in the wrong direction in terms of growth and good society. And the Kiasu thing is because Singapore's Kiasu is actually a very good example of the wrong way to do it, because people are particularly selfish there, rather than thinking about the wider needs of those around them.
Right. Okay. So, you talk about how economics has failed us as well. And looking at where we're heading and all that, do you see, with some measures, with acts in place and regulations in place, are we on track in some places? Do you see a bright spark anywhere?
I think there clearly is the potential for us to change the way we're thinking. I worry that we need a crisis, and a real crisis, not like the 2007 one. We need something much bigger before we suddenly waken up and realize that we need to take a different approach to our use of the world's resources, or indeed the way we think about progress. But there are countries that are waking up to this. Bhutan, strangely enough, now has a national happiness index rather than measuring growth. It tries to look at the prosperity of its citizens. And countries like France and even Britain are beginning to look at this and think about what they can do to change the way their societies develop. So I think there are the beginnings of change, and there are also groups setting up across the world. There are now nearly 400 towns and villages which are looking at creating a much more sustainable use of the world's resources and a much more sustainable economy for themselves. So there are signs of change which are very positive, but I think we need something more broad, and that needs more global thinking and action, quite frankly, and that's going to take some time.
Is the onus on businesses and corporations working in tandem with government, or do you see the government taking the lead?
I think it has to be. I mean, the trouble is that the corporations and governments that we have today are the ones that cause the problem. I mean, they are responsible for the financial crisis and the debts that we have. So, to some extent, they're the worst people to try and fix it, but they're also the people in charge. But I think we need some new thinking in both of those. Adam Smith talked about the power of monopolies as being one of the biggest evils in classical economics. And yet if we look at the world today, in so many industries and so many sectors, they're dominated by big companies, which are effective monopolies. And tackling that is going to need some sort of intergovernmental action so that we can bring these businesses back into line. And I'm not in any way suggesting that they need to be broken apart, but they need to serve the needs of humanity and society, not just live for profit.
Right. And you also dedicated a chapter on China. Now, why is China's rising influence a challenge for us?
China, of course, is the fastest growing economy in the world. It's the second biggest economy in the world. And what we've seen so far is mostly companies going in. And what we're seeing there is the beginnings of a battle for resources between the world's superpowers. And if you look at what's happened, particularly in Africa and in Sri Lanka, that battle has so far been pretty bad for politics. It's been bad for human rights, and it's been bad for the social development of these countries. And so rather than helping these countries develop, what I worry about is that China's rise and its need for resources will lead to perhaps even more extreme forms of colonial thinking in some of these countries, because people are only interested in their resources and not in their development.
Right. And, what are the implications of these failures? And I think you covered finance as well. But what about in terms of health?
Yeah. I mean, I'm trying to give a sort of siren call that we need to change direction, because if we don't change direction, it's not just that we're bust financially. We're going to cause all sorts of problems as we get into difficulties with climate change, with water shortages and with energy shortages, which will lead to declines in health standards today. We've already seen the growth in population and our inability to deal with some of their needs. That there's more than 1 billion people in the world suffering from hunger today. And as we increase the population and as the cost of oil in particular rises, then the cost of medicines and anesthetics will also rise, and that will make medical care for a lot of people much more expensive. On top of that, we've got the effects of climate change and an aging population in places like the US and Europe, which is going to put many more strains on the healthcare systems of those countries. So again, unless we begin to change the way we think about this and perhaps allocate the resources that we've got more fairly, then we're going to see not just worsening medical problems for a lot of people in the world, particularly the poor, but rising sources of conflict because of this too.
So what must we do in this age of endarkenment, a terminology you talked about? What does it mean, and what can we do?
Well, endarkenment was actually the original title of the book, but nobody else could understand it, so we changed it. But the idea was that there was the Enlightenment. There was this flowering of thinking and arts and social responsibility, and all of us questioning what we were doing in the world in the late 1700s, early 1800s in Europe and the US, and it led to this flowering of ideas and creation of all sorts of principles that we still live by today. But what we're doing is we're bringing in endarkenment. We're instead of bringing light, we're bringing dark to the world by thinking about these things the wrong way now. We're become greedy and obsessive, and so we're heading in the wrong direction, and that's really what the book's about. What can we do? Well, I think the first thing we need to do is wake up and realize where we're going, and then we can begin a discussion about what we should be doing, and that's really the most important part.
And that starts with the individual.
That starts with the individual, yes.
And can the individual make demands and, expectations from the government and businesses in how they operate?
I mean, there's a whole question about where we want governments to be and how we want corporations to be run. I mean, there is also a question about whether or not we need nations as we have them today, whether or not the idea even that the nation state is dead. And when you look at some of the efforts that are being made by groups to set up small, sustainable economies, they really have moved away from national government, which has really failed them, I suppose, to some extent. But I think what we need to do is get together and work out how we want to be managed, how we want to be governed, how we want to price the world's resources, whether or not we want companies and some of those banks that are making $100 million a day by gambling, whether or not that's a good thing for society, and begin to change the legislation and the way we regulate markets, because markets have to be regulated.
Right. Well, thanks for the enlightenment. I've been speaking to Graeme Maxton, talking about his book, The End of Progress. This is Resource Center, BFM 89.9.
The Resource Center on BFM 89.9 is brought to you by Alliance Bank, where you're more than just a customer. With Alliance Bank, it's banking made personal.
BFM 89.9. The business station.
And we're talking about his book, The End of Progress. It has been nominated for the Financial Times and